Chapter 25. America moves to the city, 1865 to 1900. Born in the country, America moved to the city in the decades following the Civil War. By the year 1900, the United States' upsurging population nearly doubled from its level of some 40 million souls enumerated in the census of 1870. But in the very same period, the population of American cities tripled. By the end of the 19th century, 4 out of 10 Americans were city dwellers, in striking contrast to the rustic population of stagecoach days. This cityward drift affected not only the United States, but the entire industrializing world. European peasants, pushed off the land in part by competition from cheap American foodstuffs, were pulled into cities, in both Europe and America, by the new lure of industrial jobs. A revolution in American agriculture thus fed the industrial and urban revolutions in Europe, as well as in the United States. The growth of American metropolises was spectacular. In 1860, no city in the United States could boast 1 million inhabitants. By 1890, New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia had vaulted past the million mark. By 1900, New York, with some 3.5 million people, was the second largest city in the world, outranked only by London. Throughout the world, cities were exploding. London, Paris, Berlin, Tokyo, Moscow, Mexico City, Calcutta, and Shanghai all doubled or tripled in size between 1850 and 1900. The population of Buenos Aires multiplied by more than 10. American cities grew both up and out. The cloud-brushing skyscraper allowed more people and workplaces to be packed into a parcel of land. Appearing first as a 10-story building in Chicago in 1885, the skyscraper was made usable by the perfecting of the electric elevator. An opinionated Chicago architect, Louis Sullivan, contributed formidably to the further development of the skyscraper with his famous principle that form follows function. Nesting loftily above city streets in the new steel skeleton high-rises that Sullivan helped to make popular, many Americans were becoming modern cliff dwellers. Americans were also becoming commuters, carted daily between home and job on the mass transit lines that radiated out from central cities to surrounding suburbs. Electric trolleys, powered by wagging antennae from overhead wires, propelled city limits explosively outward. By the end of the century, the nation's first subway opened in Boston. London had led the way by building a subway as early as 1863. The compact and communal walking city, its boundaries fixed by the limits of leg power, gave way to the immense and impersonal megalopolis, carved into distinctly different districts for business, industry, and residential neighborhoods, which were in turn segregated by race, ethnicity, and social class. Rural life could not compete with the siren song of the city. Industrial jobs, above all, drew people off farms in America, as well as abroad, and into factory centers. But the urban lifestyle also held powerful attractions. The pre-dawn milking of cows had little appeal when compared with the late-night glitter of city lights, particularly alluring to young adults yearning for independence. Electricity, indoor plumbing, and telephones, whose numbers leapt from some 50,000 in 1880 to over 1 million in 1900, all made life in the big city more enticing. Engineering marvels like the skyscraper and New York's awesome Brooklyn Bridge, a harp-like suspension span dedicated in 1883, further added to the seductive glamour of the gleaming cities. Cavernous department stores such as Macy's in New York and Marshall Field's in Chicago attracted urban, middle-class shoppers and provided urban working-class jobs, many of them for women. The bustling emporiums also heralded a dawning era of consumerism and accentuated widening class divisions. When Carrie Meeber, novelist Theodore Dreiser's fictional heroine in Sister Carrie, escapes from rural boredom to Chicago just before the turn of the century, it is the spectacle of the city's dazzling department stores that awakens her fateful yearning for a richer, more elegant way of life, for entry into the privileged urban middle class, whose existence she had scarcely imagined in the rustic countryside. The move to the city introduced Americans to new ways of living. Country dwellers produced little household waste. Domestic animals or scavenging pigs ate food scraps on the farm. Rural women mended and darned worn clothing rather than discard it. Household products were sold in bulk at the local store without wrapping. Mail-order houses such as Sears and Montgomery Ward, which increasingly displaced the rural general store in the late 19th century, at first did not list trash barrels or garbage cans in their catalogs. In the city, however, goods came in throwaway bottles, boxes, bags, and cans. Apartment houses had no adjoining barnyards where residents might toss garbage to the hogs. Cheap, ready-to-wear clothing and swiftly changing fashions pushed out suits and dresses out of the closet and onto the trash heap. Waste disposal, in short, was an issue new to the urban age, and the mountains of waste that urbanites generated further testify to a cultural shift away from the virtues of thrift to the conveniences of consumerism. The jagged skyline of America's perpendicular civilization could not fully conceal the canker sores of a feverish growth. Criminals flourished like lice in the teeming asphalt jungles. Sanitary facilities could not keep pace with the mushrooming population explosion. Impure water, uncollected garbage, unwashed bodies, and droppings from draft animals enveloped many cities in a satanic stench. Baltimore was described as smelling like 1 billion polecats. The cities were monuments of contradiction. They represented humanity compressed, remarked one observer, the best and the worst combined in a strangely composite community. They harbored merchant princes and miserable paupers, stately banks and sooty factories, green-grass suburbs and treeless ghettos, towering skyscrapers and stinking tenements. The glaring contrast that assaulted the eye in New York reminded one visitor of a lady in ball costume, with diamonds in her ears and her toes out at the boots. Worst of all were the human pigsties known as slums. They seemed to grow ever more crowded, more filthy, and more rat-infested, especially after the perfection in 1879 of the dumbbell tenement, so named because of the outline of its floor plan. The dumbbell was usually 7 or 8 stories high, with shallow, sunless, and ill-smelling air shafts providing minimal ventilation. Several families were sardined onto each floor of the barracks-like structures, and they shared a malodorous toilet in the hall. In these fetid warrens, conspicuously in New York's lung block, hundreds of fortunate urbanites coughed away their lives. Flop houses abounded where the half-starved and unemployed might sleep for a few cents on verminous mattresses. Small wonder that slum dwellers strove mightily to escape their wretched surroundings, as many of them did. The slums remained foul places, inhabited by successive waves of newcomers. To a remarkable degree, hard-working people moved up and out of them. Cities were dangerous for everyone. In 1871, 2/3 of downtown Chicago burned in a raging fire that left 90,000 people homeless and destroyed more than 15,000 buildings. Closely packed wooden structures fed the insatiable flames, prompting Chicago and other wary cities to require stone and iron buildings downtown. The wealthiest began to leave the risky cities behind and head for semi-rural suburbs. These leafy bedroom communities eventually ringed the brick and concrete cities with a greenbelt of affluence. The powerful pull of the American urban magnet was felt even in faraway Europe. A seemingly endless stream of immigrants continued to pour in from the old mother continent. In each of the 3 decades from the 1850s through the 1870s, more than 2 million migrants had stepped onto America's shores. By the 1880s, the stream had swelled to a rushing torrent, as more than 5 million cascaded into the country. A new high for a single year was reached in 1882, when 788,992 arrived, or more than 2,100 a day. Until the 1880s, most immigrants had come from the British Isles and Western Europe, chiefly Germany and Ireland. Also significant were the more than 300,000 Chinese immigrants. Many of these earlier immigrants had faced virulent nativism, especially the Irish and the Chinese. In fact, the latter were legally excluded in 1882. But by the last decades of the century, the old European immigrants had adjusted well to American life by building supportive ethnic organizations and melding into established farm communities or urban craft unions. Although many still lived, worked, and worshipped among their own, they were largely accepted as American by the native born. In the 1880s, the character of the immigrant stream changed drastically. The so-called new immigrants came from Southern and Eastern Europe. Among them were Italians, Jews, Croats, Slovaks, Greeks, and Poles. They came from countries with little history of democratic government, where people had grown accustomed to cringing before despotism, and where opportunities for advancement were few. These new peoples totaled only 19% of the in-pouring immigrants in the 1880s, but by the first decade of the 20th century, they constituted an astonishing 66% of the total inflow. They hived together in cities like New York and Chicago, where the Little Italys and Little Poland soon claimed more inhabitants than many of the largest cities of the same nationality in the Old World. Why were these bright-shawled and quaint-jacketed strangers hammering on the gates? In part, they left their native countries because Europe seemed to have no room for them. The population of the Old World was growing vigorously. It nearly doubled in the centuries after 1800, thanks in part to abundant supplies of fish and grain from America, and to the widespread cultivation in Europe of that humble New World transplant, the potato. American food imports and the galloping pace of European industrialization shook the peasantry loose from its ancient habitats and customary occupations, creating a vast, footloose army of the unemployed. Europeans by the millions drained out of the countryside and into European cities. Most stayed there, but some kept moving and left Europe altogether. About 60 million Europeans abandoned the old continent in the 19th and early 20th centuries. More than half of them moved to the United States, while their compatriots spread out across the globe to South America, Canada, Africa, and Australia. Masses of people were already in motion in Europe before they felt the tug of the American magnet. This European diaspora, dominated by immigration to the United States, was in many ways simply a byproduct of the urbanization of Europe. America fever proved highly contagious in Europe. The United States was often painted as a land of fabulous opportunity in the America letters sent by friends and relatives already transplanted, letters that were soiled by the hands of many readers. "We eat here every day," wrote one jubilant Pole, "what we get only for Easter in our native country." The land of the free was also blessed with freedom from military conscription and institutionalized religious persecution. Profit-seeking Americans trumpeted throughout Europe the attractions of the new Promised Land. Industrialists wanted low-wage labor. Railroads wanted buyers for their land grants. States wanted more population, and steamship lines wanted more human cargo for their holds. In fact, the ease and cheapness of steam-powered shipping greatly accelerated the transoceanic surge. As the century lengthened, savage persecutions of minorities in Europe drove many shattered souls to American shores. In the 1880s, the Russians turned violently upon their own Jews, chiefly in the Polish areas. Tens of thousands of these battered refugees, survivors of centuries of harassment as hated outcasts, fled their burning homes. They made their way to the seaboard cities of the Atlantic coast, notably New York. Jews had experienced city life in Europe, a circumstance that made them virtually unique among the new immigrants. Many of them brought their urban skills of tailoring or shopkeeping to American cities. Destitute and devout, Eastern European Jews were frequently given a frosty reception, not only by old-stock Americans, but also by those German Jews who had arrived decades earlier and prospered in the United States, some as garment manufacturers who now employed their co-religionists as cheap labor. Many of the immigrants never intended to become Americans in any case. A large number of them were single men who worked in the United States for several months or years, and then returned home with their hard-earned roll of American dollars. Some 25% of the nearly 20 million people who arrived between 1820 and 1900 were birds of passage who eventually returned to their country of origin. For them, the attraction of the American magnet was never strong. Even those who stayed in America struggled heroically to preserve their traditional culture. Catholics expanded their parochial school systems, and Jews established Hebrew schools. Foreign language newspapers abounded. Yiddish theaters, kosher food stores, Polish parishes, Greek restaurants, and Italian social clubs all attested to the desire to keep old ways alive. Yet time took its toll on these efforts to conserve the customs of the old world in the new. The children of the immigrants grew up speaking fluent English, sometimes mocking the broken grammar of their parents. They often rejected the old country manners of their mothers and fathers in their desire to plunge headlong into the mainstream of American life. America's government system, nurtured in wide open spaces, was well suited to the cement forests of the great cities. Beyond minimal checking to weed out criminals and the insane, the federal government did virtually nothing to ease the assimilation of immigrants into American society. State governments, usually dominated by rural representatives, did even less. City governments, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of rampant urban growth, proved woefully inadequate to the task. By default, the business of ministering to the immigrants' needs fell to the unofficial governments of the urban political machines, led by bosses like New York's notorious Boss Tweed. Taking care of the immigrants was big business indeed. Trading jobs and services for votes, a powerful boss might claim the loyalty of thousands of followers. In return for their support at the polls, the boss provided jobs on the city's payroll, found housing for new arrivals, tided over the needy with gifts of food and clothing, patched up minor scrapes with the law, and helped get schools, parks, and hospitals built in immigrant neighborhoods. Reformers gagged at this cynical exploitation of the immigrant vote, but the political boss gave valuable assistance that was forthcoming from no other source. The nation's social conscience, slumbering since the anti-slavery crusade, gradually awakened to the plight of the cities, and especially their immigrant masses. Prominent in this awakening were several Protestant clergymen who sought to apply the lessons of Christianity to the slums and factories. Noteworthy among them was Walter Rauschenbach, who in 1886 became pastor of a German Baptist church in New York City. Also conspicuous was Washington Gladden, who took over a Congregational church in Columbus, Ohio in 1882. Preaching the social gospel, they both insisted that the churches tackle the burning social issues of the day. The Sermon on the Mount, they declared, was the science of society, and many social gospelers predicted that socialism would be the logical outcome of Christianity. These Christian socialists did much to prick callous middle-class consciences, thus preparing the path for the progressive reform movement after the turn of the century. One middle-class woman who was deeply dedicated to uplifting the urban masses was Jane Addams. Born into a prosperous Illinois family, Addams was one of the first generation of college-educated women. Upon her graduation, she sought other outlets for her large talents than could be found in teaching or charitable volunteer work, than the only permissible occupations for a young woman of her social class. Inspired by a visit to England, she acquired the decaying Hull Mansion in Chicago in 1889. There she established Hull House, the most prominent, though not the first, American settlement house. Soft-spoken but tenacious, Addams became a kind of urban American saint in the eyes of many admirers. The philosopher William James told her, "You utter instinctively the truth we others vainly seek." She was a broad-gauge reformer who courageously condemned war as well as poverty, and she eventually won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931. But her pacifism also earned her the enmity of some Americans, including the Daughters of the American Revolution, who choked on her anti-war views and expelled her from membership in their august organization. Located in poor immigrant neighborhood of Greeks, Italians, Russians, and Germans, Hull House offered instruction in English, counseling to help newcomers cope with American big city life, child care services for working mothers, and cultural activities for neighborhood residents. Following Jane Addams's lead, women founded settlement houses in other cities as well. Conspicuous among the houses was Lillian Ward's Henry Street Settlement in New York, which opened its doors in 1893. The settlement houses became centers of women's activism and of social reform. The women of Hull House successfully lobbied in 1893 for an Illinois anti-sweatshop law that protected women workers and prohibited child labor. They were led in this case by the black-clad Florence Kelley, a guerrilla warrior in the urban jungle. Armed with the insights of socialism and endowed with the voice of an actress, Kelly was a lifelong battler for the welfare of women, children, blacks, and consumers. She later moved to the Henry Street settlement in New York and served for 3 decades as General Secretary of the National Consumers League. The pioneering work of Adams, Wald, and Kelly helped blaze the trail that many women and some men later followed into careers in urban reform and the new profession of social work. For these female reformers, and for many other women, the city offered a new kind of frontier opportunity. Antiforeignism, or nativism, earlier touched off by the Irish and German arrivals in the 1840s and 1850s, bared its ugly face in the 1880s with fresh ferocity. The new immigrants had come for much the same reasons as the old: to escape the poverty and squalor of Europe and to seek new opportunities in America. But nativists worried that America was becoming not a melting pot, but a dumping ground. They viewed the Eastern and Southern Europeans as culturally and religiously exotic hordes, and often gave them a rude reception. The newest newcomers aroused widespread alarm. Their high birth rate, common among people with a low standard of living and sufficient youth and vigor to pull up stakes, raised worries that the original Anglo-Saxon stock would soon be outbred and outvoted. Still more horrifying was the prospect that it would be mongrelized by a mixture of inferior Southern European blood, and that the fairer Anglo-Saxon types would disappear. One New England writer cried out in anguish, "O liberty, white goddess, is it well to leave the gates unguarded?" Native-born Americans voiced additional fears. They blamed the immigrants for the degradation of the urban government. Some trade unionists assailed the alien arrivals for their willingness to work for starvation wages that seemed to them like princely sums, and for importing in their intellectual baggage such seemingly dangerous doctrines as socialism, communism, and anarchism. Many business leaders who had welcomed the flood of cheap manual labor began to fear that they had embraced a Frankenstein's monster. Anti-foreign organizations, reminiscent of the know-nothings of antebellum days, were now revived in a different guise. Notorious among them was the American Protective Association, or APA, which was created in 1887 and soon claimed 1 million members. In pursuing its nativist goals, the APA urged voting against Roman Catholic candidates for office and sponsored the publication of lustful fantasies about runaway nuns. Organized labor was quick to throw its growing weight behind the move to choke off the rising tide of foreigners. Frequently used as strikebreakers, the wage-depressing immigrants were hard to unionize because of the language barrier. Labor leaders argued, not illogically, that if American industry was entitled to protection from foreign goods, American workers were entitled to protection from foreign laborers. Congress finally nailed up partial bars against the importing immigrants. The first restrictive law, passed in 1882, banged the gate shut in the faces of paupers, criminals, and convicts, all of whom had to be returned at the expense of the greedy or careless shipper. Most dramatic of all was a law the same year to bar completely an entire ethnic group, the Chinese. Congress further responded to pained outcries from organized labor when in 1885 it prohibited the importation of foreign workers under contract, usually for substandard wages. In later years, other federal laws lengthened the list of undesirables to include the insane, polygamists, prostitutes, alcoholics, anarchists, and people carrying contagious diseases. It proposed a literacy test, long a favorite of nativists because it favored the old immigrants over the new, met vigorous opposition. It was not enacted until 1917, after 3 presidents had vetoed it on the grounds that literacy was more a measure of opportunity than of intelligence. In 1886, the Statue of Liberty arose in New York Harbor, a gift from the people of France. On its base were inscribed the words of Emma Lazarus, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore." To many nativists, those noble words described only too accurately the scum washed up by the new immigrant tides. Yet the uprooted immigrants, unlike natives lucky enough to have had parents who caught an earlier ship, became American citizens the hard way. They stepped off the boat, many of them full-grown and well-muscled, ready to put their shoulders to the nation's industrial wheels. The Republic owes much to these latecomers, for their brawn, their brains, their courage, and the yeasty diversity they brought to the American society. The swelling size and changing character of the urban population posed sharp challenges to American churches, which, like other national institutions, had grown up in the country. Protestant churches in particular suffered heavily from the shift to the city, where many of their traditional doctrines and pastoral approaches seemed irrelevant. Some of the larger houses of worship, with their stained glass windows and thundering pipe organs, were tending to become merely sacred diversions or amusements. Reflecting the wealth of their prosperous parishioners, many of the old line churches were distressingly slow to raise their voices against social and economic vices. John D. Rockefeller was a pillar of the Baptist Church, J. Pierpont Morgan of the Episcopal Church. Trinity Episcopal Church in New York actually owned some of the city's worst slum property. Cynics remarked that the Episcopal Church had become the Republican Party at prayer. Some religious leaders began to worry that in the age-old struggle between God and the devil, the wicked one was registering dismaying gains. The mounting emphasis was on materialism. Too many devotees worshipped at the altar of avarice. Money was the accepted measure of achievement, and the new gospel of wealth proclaimed that God caused the righteous to prosper. Into this spreading moral vacuum stepped a new generation of liberal Protestants. With roots in the Unitarian revolt against Orthodox Calvinism, liberal ideas came into the mainstream of American Protestantism between 1875 and 1925, despite frequent and bitter controversies with fundamentalists. Entrenched in the leadership and seminaries of the dominant denominations, liberal Protestants adapted religious ideas to modern culture, attempting to reconcile Christianity with new scientific and economic doctrines. They rejected biblical literalism, urging Christians to view biblical stories as models for Christian behavior rather than as dogma. They stressed the ethical teachings of the Bible and allied themselves with the reform-oriented social gospel movement and urban revivalists like Dwight Lyman Moody, a former shoe salesman who captivated audiences with his message of forgiveness. Their optimistic trust in community fellowship and their focus on earthly salvation and personal growth attracted many followers. They helped Protestant Americans reconcile their religious faith with modern, cosmopolitan ways of thinking. Simultaneously, the Roman Catholic and Jewish faiths were gaining enormous strength from the new immigration. By 1900, Roman Catholics had become the largest single denomination, numbering nearly 9 million communicants. Cardinal James Gibbons, an urban Catholic leader devoted to American unity, was immensely popular with Roman Catholics and Protestants alike. Acquainted with every president from Johnson to Harding, he employed his liberal sympathies to assist the American labor movement. By 1890, the variety-loving Americans could choose from 150 religious denominations, 2 of them brand new. One was the band-playing Salvation Army, whose soldiers without swords invaded America from England in 1879 and established a beachhead on the country's street corners. Appealing frankly to the down and outers, this boldly named Salvation Army did much practical good, especially with free soup. The other important new faith was the Church of Christ, Scientist, Christian Science, founded by Mary Baker Eddy in 1879, after she had suffered much ill health. Preaching that the true practice of Christianity heals sickness, she set forth her views in a book entitled Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, which sold an amazing 400,000 copies before her death. A fertile field for converts was found in America's hurried, nerve-racked, and urbanized civilization, to which Eddy held out the hope of relief from discords and diseases through prayer as taught by Christian Science. By the time she died in 1910, she had founded an influential church that embraced several 100,000 devoted worshippers. Urbanites also participated in a new kind of religious-affiliated organization, the Young Men's and Women's Christian Associations, the YMCA, and the YWCA, established in the United States before the Civil War, grew by leaps and bounds. Combining physical and other kinds of education with religious instruction, The Whys appeared in virtually every major American city by the end of the 19th century. The old-time religion received many blows from modern trends, including a booming sale of books on comparative religion and on historical criticism as applied to the Bible. Most unsettling of all were the writings of the English naturalist Charles Darwin. In lucid prose, he set forth a sensational theory that higher forms of life had slowly evolved from lower forms through a process of random biological mutation and adaptation. Though not the first scientist to propose an evolutionary hypothesis, Darwin broke new ground with his idea of natural selection. Nature, in his view, blindly selected organisms for survival or death based on random, inheritable variations that they happened to possess. Some traits conferred advantages in the struggle for life, and hence better odds of passing them along to offspring. By providing a material explanation for the evolutionary process, Darwin's theory explicitly rejected the dogma of special creations, which ascribed the designs of each fixed species to divine agency. Darwin's radical ideas evoked the wrath of scientists and laymen alike. Many zoologists, like Harvard's Louis Agassiz, held fast to the old doctrine of special creations. By 1875, however, the majority of scientists in America and elsewhere had embraced the theory of organic evolution, though not all endorsed natural selection as its agent. Clergymen and theologians responded to Darwin's theory in several ways. At first, most believers joined scientists in rejecting his ideas outright. After 1875, by which time most natural scientists had embraced evolution, the religious community split into two camps. A conservative minority stood firmly behind the Scripture as the infallible Word of God, and they condemned what they thought was the bestial hypothesis of the Darwinians. Their rejection of scientific consensus spawned a muscular view of biblical authority that eventually gave rise to fundamentalism in the 20th century. Most religious thinkers parted company with the conservatives and flatly refused to accept the Bible in its entirety as either history or science. They feared that hostility toward evolution would alienate educated believers. Over time, an increasing number of liberal thinkers were able to reconcile Darwinism with Christianity. They heralded the revolutionary theory as a newer and grander revelation of the ways of the Almighty. As one commentator observed, some call it evolution, and others call it God. Darwinism undoubtedly did much to loosen religious moorings and to promote skepticism among the gospel-glutted. While the liberal efforts at compromise did succeed in keeping many Americans in the pews, those compromises also tended to relegate religious teachings to matter of personal faith, private conduct, and family life. As science began to explain more of the external world, commentators on nature and society increasingly refrained from adding religious perspectives to the discussion. Public education continued its upward climb. The ideal of tax-supported elementary schools, adopted on a nationwide basis before the Civil War, was still gathering strength. Americans were accepting the truism that a free government cannot function successfully if the people are shackled by ignorance. Beginning about 1870, more and more states were making at least a grade school education compulsory, and this gain, incidentally, helped check the frightful abuses of child labor. Spectacular indeed was the spread of high schools, especially in the 1880s and 1890s. Before the Civil War, private academies at the secondary level were common, and tax-supported high schools were rare, numbering only a few hundred. But the concept that a high school education, as well as a grade school education, was the birthright of every citizen was now gaining impressive support. By 1900, there were some 6,000 high schools. In addition, free textbooks were being provided in increasing quantities by the taxpayers of the states during the last 2 decades of the century. Other trends were noteworthy. Teacher training schools, then called normal schools, experienced a striking expansion after the Civil War. In 1860, there were only 12 of them. In 1910, over 300 kindergartens, earlier borrowed from Germany, also began to gain strong support. The new immigration in the 1880s and 1890s brought vast new strength to private Catholic parochial schools, which were fast becoming a major pillar in the nation's educational structure. In the realm of adult education, the Chautauqua movement, launched in 1874 on the shores of Lake Chautauqua in New York, sponsored public lectures and home study courses nationwide that reached hundreds of thousands of knowledge-hungry men and women. Crowded cities, despite their cancers, generally provided better educational facilities than the old one-room, one-teacher red schoolhouse. The success of the public schools is confirmed by the falling of the illiteracy rate from 20% in 1870 to 10.7% in 1900. Americans were developing a profound faith in formal education as the sovereign remedy for their ills. War-torn and impoverished, the South lagged far behind other regions in public education, and African Americans suffered most severely. A staggering 44% of non-whites were illiterate in 1900. Some help came from Northern philanthropists, but the foremost champion of black education was an ex-slave, Booker T. Washington. His classic autobiography, Up from Slavery, tells how he slept under a board sidewalk to save pennies for his schooling. Called in 1881 to head the black normal and industrial school at Tuskegee, Alabama, he began with 40 students in a tumble-down shanty. Undaunted, he taught black students useful trades so that they could gain self-respect and economic security. Washington's self-help approach to solving the nation's racial problems was labeled accommodationist because it stopped short of directly challenging white supremacy. Recognizing the depths of Southern white racism, Washington avoided the issue of social equality. Instead, he grudgingly acquiesced in segregation in return for the right to develop, however modestly and painstakingly, the economic and educational resources of the black community. Economic independence would ultimately be the ticket, Washington believed, to black political and civil rights. Washington's commitment to training young blacks in agriculture and the trades guided the curriculum at Tuskegee Institute and made it an ideal place for slave-born George Washington Carver to teach and research. After Carver joined the faculty in 1896, he became an internationally famous agricultural chemist who provided a much-needed boost to the Southern economy by discovering hundreds of new uses for the lowly peanut, shampoo, axle grease, sweet potatoes, as in vinegar, and soybean, paints. Other black leaders, notably Dr. WEB Dubois, assailed Booker T. Washington as an Uncle Tom, who was condemning their race to manual labor and perpetual inferiority. Born in Massachusetts, Dubois was a mixture of African, French, Dutch, and Indian blood. Thank God no Anglo-Saxon, he would add. After a determined struggle, he earned a Ph.D. at Harvard, the first of his race to achieve that goal. The honor, I assure you, was Harvard's, he said. He demanded complete equality for blacks, social as well as economic, and helped found the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, in 1909. Rejecting Washington's gradualism and separatism, he argued that the talented tenth of the black community should be given full and immediate access to the mainstream of American life. An exceptionally skilled historian, sociologist, and poet, he died in self-exile in Africa in 1963 at the age of 95. Many of Du Bois's differences with Washington reflected the contrasting life experiences of Southern and Northern blacks. Colleges and universities also shot up like lusty young saplings in the decades after the Civil War. A college education increasingly seemed indispensable in the scramble for the golden apple of success. Even women and African Americans were finding new opportunities for higher education. Women's colleges such as Vassar were gaining ground, and universities open to both genders were blossoming, notably in the Midwest. By 1880, every third college graduate was a woman. By the turn of the century, the black institutes and academies planted during Reconstruction had blossomed into a crop of Southern black colleges. Howard University in Washington, D.C., Hampton Institute in Virginia, Atlanta University, and numerous others nurtured higher education for blacks until the civil rights movement of the 1960s made widespread attendance at white institutions possible. The truly phenomenal growth of higher education owed much to the Morrill Act of 1862. This enlightened law provided a generous grant of public lands to the states for support of education. Land-grant colleges, most of which became state universities, in turn bound themselves to provide certain services, such as military training. The Hatch Act of 1887 extended the Morrill Act, provided federal funds for the establishment of agricultural experiment stations in connection with the land-grant colleges. These two pieces of legislation spawned over 100 colleges and universities, including such institutions as the University of California, the Ohio State University, and Texas A&M. Private philanthropy richly supplanted government grants to higher education. Many of the new industrial millionaires developed tender social consciences, donated immense fortunes to educational enterprises. A philanthropist was cynically described as one who steals privately and gives publicly. In the 20 years from 1878 to 1898, those money barons gave away about $150 million. Noteworthy among the new private universities of high quality were Cornell and Leland Stanford Jr., the latter founded in memory of the deceased 15-year-old only child of a builder of the Central Pacific Railroad. The University of Chicago, opened in 1892, speedily forged into a front-rank position, owing largely to the lubricant of John D. Rockefeller's oil millions. Rockefeller died at 97, after having given some $550 million for philanthropic purposes. Significant also was the sharp increase in professional and technical schools, where modern laboratories were replacing the solo experiments performed by instructors in front of their classes. Towering among the specialized institutions was Johns Hopkins University, opened in 1876, which maintained the nation's first high-grade graduate school. Several generations of American scholars, repelled by snobbish English cousins and attracted by painstaking continental methods, had attended German universities. Johns Hopkins ably carried on the Germanic tradition of profusely footnoted tomes. Reputable scholars no longer had to go abroad for a gilt-edged graduate degree. Dr. Woodrow Wilson, among others, received his Ph.D. from Johns Hopkins. Homegrown influences shaped the modern American university as much as German models. Antebellum colleges had stressed the unity of truth, or the idea that knowledge and morality existed in a single system. Religious instruction in moral philosophy and natural theology served as pillars of the old classical curriculum. In the wake of the Darwinian challenge, when religion and science seemed less compatible, university reformers struggled to reconcile scientific education and religion to preserve the unity of moral and intellectual purpose. When that effort faltered, university educators abandoned moral instruction and divorced facts from values. Other pressures also helped doom the traditional curriculum. The new industrialization brought insistent demands for practical courses and specialized vocational training in the sciences. The elective system, where students selected courses, was gaining popularity. Reformers also emphasized fields of concentration to prepare students for entry into a profession. Specialization, not synthesis, became the primary goal of a university education. The reform spirit received a powerful boost in the 1870s when Dr. Charles W. Eliot, a vigorous young chemist, became president of Harvard College and embarked upon a lengthy career of educational statesmanship. As a sign of the secularizing times, Eliot changed Harvard's motto from Christo et Ecclesiae, for Christ and Church, to Veritas, truth. Medical schools and medical science after the Civil War were prospering. Despite the enormous sale of patent medicines and so-called Indian remedies, good for man or beast, the new scientific gains were reflected in improved public health. Revolutionary discoveries abroad, such as those of the French scientist Louis Pasteur and the English physician Joseph Lister, left their imprint on America. The popularity of the heavy whiskers waned as the century ended. Such hairy adornments were now coming to be regarded as germ traps. As a result of new health-promoting precautions, including campaigns against public spitting, life expectancy at birth was measurably increased. One of America's most brilliant intellectuals, the slight and sickly William James, served for 35 years on the Harvard faculty. Through his numerous writings, he made a deep mark on many fields. His principles of psychology helped to establish the modern discipline of behavioral psychology. In The Will to Believe and Varieties of Religious Experience, he explored the philosophy and psychology of religion. In his most famous work, Pragmatism, He pronounced that America's greatest contribution to the history of philosophy was the concept of pragmatism, that the truth of an idea was to be tested, above all, by its practical consequences. Books continued to be a major source of edification and enjoyment for both juveniles and adults. Bestsellers of the 1880s were generally old favorites like David Copperfield and Ivanhoe. Well-stocked public libraries, the poor person's university, were making encouraging progress, especially in Boston and New York. The magnificent Library of Congress building, which opened its doors in 1897, provided 13 acres of floor space in the largest and costliest edifice of its time in the world. A new era was inaugurated by the generous gifts of Andrew Carnegie. This open-handed Scotsman, book-starved in his youth, contributed $60 million for the construction of nearly 1,700 public libraries all over the country, with an additional 750 scattered around the English-speaking world, from Great Britain to New Zealand. By 1900, there were about 9,000 free circulating libraries in America, each with at least 300 books. Roaring newspaper presses, spurred by the invention of the linotype in 1885, more than kept pace with the demands of a word-hungry public. But the heavy investment in machinery and plant was accompanied by a growing fear of offending advertisers and subscribers. Bare-knuckle editorials were, to an increasing degree, being supplanted by feature articles and non-controversial syndicated material. The day of slashing journalistic giants like Horace Greeley was passing. Sensationalism, at the same time, was capturing the public taste. The semi-literate immigrants, combined with strap-hanging urban commuters, created a profitable market for news that was simply and punchily written. Sex, scandal, and other human interest stories burst into the headlines as a vulgarization of the press accompanied the growth of circulation. Critics now complained in vain of these prostitutes. Two new journalistic tycoons emerged. Joseph Pulitzer, Hungarian-born and near-blind, was a leader in the techniques of sensationalism through his ownership of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and the New York World. His use of colored comic supplements featuring the Yellow Kid gave the name Yellow Journalism to its lurid sheets. A close and ruthless competitor was the youthful William Randolph Hearst, who had been expelled from Harvard College for a crude prank. Able to draw on his California father's mining millions, he ultimately built a powerful chain of newspapers, beginning with the San Francisco Examiner in 1887. Unfortunately, the overall influence of Pulitzer and Hearst was not altogether wholesome. Although both championed many worthy causes, both prostituted the press in their struggle for increased circulation. Both stooped, snooped, and scooped to conquer. Their flair for scandal and sensational rumor was happily somewhat offset by the introduction of syndicated material and by the strengthening of the news-gathering Associated Press, which had been founded in the 1840s. Magazines partially satisfied the public appetite for good reading. Notably, old East Coast standbys like Harper's, The Atlantic Monthly, and Scribner's Monthly, and new Western entrants such as the California-based Overland Monthly. Possibly the most influential journal of all was the liberal and highly intellectual New York Nation, which was read largely by professors, preachers, and publicists as the Weekly Day of Judgment. Launched in 1865 by the Irish-born Edwin L. Godkin, a merciless critic, it crusaded militantly for civil service reform, honesty in government, and a moderate tariff. The Nation attained only a modest circulation, about 10,000 in the 19th century, but Godkin believed that if he could reach the right 10,000 leaders, his ideas through them might reach tens of millions. Another journalist author, Henry George, was an original thinker who left an enduring mark. Poor in formal schooling, he was rich in idealism and in the milk of human kindness. After seeing poverty at its worst in India and land grabbing at its greediest in California, he took pen in hand. His classic treatise, Progress and Poverty, undertook to solve the great enigma of our times, the association of progress with poverty. According to George, the pressure of a growing population on a fixed supply of land unjustifiably pushed up property values, showering unearned profits on owners of land. A single 100% tax on those windfall profits would eliminate unfair inequalities and stimulate economic growth. George soon became a most controversial figure, His single tax idea was so horrifying to the propertied classes that his manuscript was rejected by numerous publishers. Finally, brought out in 1879, the book gradually broke into the bestseller list and ultimately sold some 3 million copies. George also lectured widely in America and Britain, where he left an indelible mark on English Fabian socialism. George's proposals resounded for decades. As late as 1903, a young female follower applied for a patent for The Landlord's Game, which bore a striking resemblance to Parker Brothers' later Monopoly, released in 1935. In the earlier game, the point was not to amass property, but to expose the unfair advantage enjoyed by the landlord and to show how the single tax would discourage speculation. Edward Bellamy, a quiet Massachusetts Yankee, was another journalist reformer of remarkable power. In 1888, he published a socialistic novel, Looking Backward, in which the hero, falling into a hypnotic sleep, awakened in the year 2000. He looks backward and finds that the social and economic injustices of 1887 have melted away under an idyllic government, which has nationalized big business to serve the public interest. To a nation already alarmed by the trust evil, the book had a magnetic appeal and sold over 1 million copies. Scores of Bellamy clubs sprang up to discuss this mild utopian socialism and the heavily influenced American reform movements near the end of the century. Like other radical reformers, Victoria Woodhull shook the pillars of conventional morality when she publicly proclaimed her belief in free love in 1871. Woodhull was a beautiful and eloquent divorcee, sometime stockbroker, and tireless feminist propagandist. Together with her sister, Tennessee Claflin, she published a far-out periodical, Woodhull and Claflin's Weekly. The sisters again shocked respectable society in 1872 when their journal struck a blow for the new morality by charging that Henry Ward Beecher, the most famous preacher of his day, had for years been carrying on an adulterous affair. Pure-minded Americans sternly resisted these affronts to their moral principles. Their foremost champion was a portly crusader, Anthony Comstock, who made lifelong war on the immoral. Armed after 1873 with a federal statute, the notorious Commodore Law, this self-appointed defender of sexual purity, boasted that he had confiscated no fewer than 202,679 obscene pictures and photos, 4,185 boxes of pills, powders, etc. used by abortionists, and 26 obscene pictures framed on walls of saloons. His proud claim was that he had driven at least 15 people to suicide. The antics of the Woodhull sisters and Comstock exposed to daylight the battle in the late 19th century America over sexual attitudes and the place of women. Switchboards and typewriters in the booming cities became increasingly the tools of women's independence. Young working women headed to dance halls and nightclubs when the day was done, enjoying a new sense of freedom in the cities. This new morality began to be reflected in soaring divorce rates, the spreading practice of birth control, and increasingly frank discussion of sexual topics. By 1913, said one popular magazine, the chimes had struck 6 o'clock in America. The new urban environment was hard on families. Paradoxically, the crowded cities were emotionally isolating places. Urban families had to go it alone, separated from clan, kin, and village. As families increasingly became the virtually exclusive arena for intimate companionship and for emotional and psychological satisfaction, they were subjected to unprecedented stress. Many families cracked under the strain. The urban era launched the era of divorce. From the late 19th century dates the beginning of the divorce revolution, to transform the United States social landscape in the 20th century. Urban life also dictated changes in work habits and even in family size. Not only fathers but mothers and even children as young as 10 years old often worked, and usually in widely scattered locations. On the farm, having many children meant having more hands to help with hoeing and harvesting. But in the city, more children meant more mouths to feed, more crowding in sardine tin tenements, and more human baggage to carry in the uphill struggle for social mobility. Not surprisingly, birth rates were still dropping and family size continued to shrink as the 19th century lengthened. Marriages were being delayed, and more couples learned the techniques of birth control. The decline in family size, in fact, affected rural Americans as well as urban dwellers, and old stock natives as well as new immigrants. Women were growing more independent in the urban environment, and in 1898 they heard the voice of a major feminist prophet, Charlotte Perkins Gilman. In that year, the free-thinking and original-minded Gilman published Women and Economics, a classic of feminist literature. A distant relative of Harriet Beecher Stowe and Catherine Beecher, Gilman displayed the restless temperament and reforming zeal characteristic of the remarkable Beecher clan. Strikingly handsome, she shunned traditional feminine frills and instead devoted herself to a vigorous regimen of physical exercise and philosophical meditation. In her masterwork of 1898, Gilman called on women to abandon their dependent status and contribute to the larger life of the community through productive involvement in the economy. Rejecting all claims that biology gave women a fundamentally different character from men, she argued that our highly specialized motherhood is not so advantageous as believed. She advocated centralized nurseries and cooperative kitchens to facilitate women's participation in the workforce, anticipating by more than half a century the daycare centers and convenience food service of a later day. Gilman's call for female participation in the world of wage labor reflected epochal changes already underway, as more than 1 million women joined the workforce in the single decade of the 1890s. But strict social codes prescribed which women might work and what jobs they might hold. Because employment for wives and mothers was considered taboo, the vast majority of working women were single. Their jobs also depended on their race, ethnicity, and class. Black women had few opportunities beyond domestic service. White-collar jobs as social workers, secretaries, department store clerks, and telephone operators were largely reserved for native-born women, while immigrant women tended to cluster in particular industries, as Jewish women did in the garment trades. Although hours were often long, pay low, and advancement limited, a job still bought working women some economic and social independence. After contributing a large share of their earnings to the families, many women still had enough money in their pocketbooks to enter a new urban world of sociability, excursions to amusement parks with friends on days off, and Saturday night dances with the fellas. Beyond addressing the world of work, fiery feminists also continued to insist on the ballot. They had been demanding the vote since before the Civil War, but many high-minded female reformers had temporarily shelved the cause of women to battle for the rights of blacks. In 1890, militant suffragists formed the National American Women Suffrage Association. Its founders included aging pioneers like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who had helped organize the first Women's Rights Convention in 1848, and her longtime comrade Susan B. Anthony, the radical Quaker Spitfire, who had courted jail by trying to cast a ballot in the 1872 presidential election. By 1900, a new generation of women had taken command of the suffrage battle. Their most effective leader was Carrie Chapman Catt, a pragmatic and businesslike reformer of relentless dedication. Significantly, under Catt, the suffragists de-emphasized the argument that women deserved the vote as a matter of right, because they were in all respects the equals of men. Instead, Catt stressed the desirability of giving women the vote if they were to continue to discharge their traditional duties as homemakers and mothers in the increasingly public world of the city. Women had special responsibility for the health of the family and the education of children, the argument ran. On the farm, women could discharge these responsibilities in the separate sphere of the isolated homestead. But in the city, they needed a voice on boards of public health, police commissions, and school boards. By thus linking the ballot to a traditional definition of women's role, suffragists registered encouraging gains as the new century opened, despite continuing showers of rotten eggs and the jeers of male critics who insisted that women were made for loving, not for voting. Women were increasingly permitted to vote in local elections, particularly on issues related to the schools. Wyoming Territory, later called the Equality State, granted the first unrestricted suffrage to women in 1869. Many Western states soon followed Wyoming's example. Paralleling these triumphs, most of the states by 1890 had passed laws to permit wives to own or control their property after marriage. City life also fostered the growth of a spate of women's organizations, including the General Federation of Women's Clubs, which counted some 200,000 members in 1900. Meanwhile, in 1893, New Zealand became the first nation to grant women equal suffrage rights, further inspiring American reformers. The reborn suffrage movement and other women's organizations largely excluded black women from their ranks. Fearful that an integrated campaign would compromise its efforts to get the vote, the National American Women's Suffrage Association limited membership to whites. Black women, however, created their own associations. Journalist and teacher Ida B. Wells inspired black women to mount a nationwide anti-lynching crusade. She also helped launch the Black Women's Club movement, which culminated in the establishment of the National Association of Colored Women in 1896. Alarming gains by demon rum spurred the temperance reformers to redoubled zeal. Especially obnoxious to them was the shutter-doored corner saloon, appropriately called the poor man's club. The barroom helped keep both him and his family poor. Liquor consumption had increased during the nerve-wracking days of the Civil War, and immigrant groups, accustomed to alcohol in the old country, were hostile to restraints. Whiskey-loving foreigners in Boston would rudely hiss temperance lecturers. Many tipplers charged, with some accuracy, that temperance reform amounted to a middle-class assault on working-class lifestyles. The National Prohibition Party, organized in 1869, polled a sprinkling of voters in some of the ensuing presidential elections. Among the favorite songs of these sober souls were "I'll Marry No Man If He Drinks," "Vote Down the Vile Traffic," and "The Drunkard's Doom." Typical was this: "Now, all young men, a warning take, and shun the poison bowl. 'Twill lead you down to hell's dark gate, and ruin your own soul." Militant women entered the alcoholic arena, notably when the Women's Christian Temperance Union was organized in 1874. The white ribbon was its symbol of purity. The saintly Frances E. Willard, also a champion of Planned Parenthood, was its leading spirit. Less saintly was the muscular and mentally deranged Kansas cyclone, Carrie A. Nation, whose first husband had died of alcoholism. With her hatchet, she boldly smashed saloon bottles and bars, and her hatchetations brought considerable disrepute to the Prohibition movement because of the violence of her one-woman crusade. But rum was now on the run. The potent Anti-Saloon League was formed in 1893, with its members singing "The Saloon Must Go" and "Vote for Cold Water, Boys." Female supporters sang "The lips that touch liquor must never touch mine." Statewide prohibition, which had made surprising gains in Maine and elsewhere before the Civil War, was sweeping new states into the dry column. The great triumph, but only a temporary one, came in 1919, when the National Prohibition Amendment, the 18th, was attached to the Constitution. Banners of other social crusaders were aloft. The American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals was created in 1866 after its founder had witnessed brutality to horses in Russia. The American Red Cross was launched in 1881 with the dynamic and diminutive 5-foot-tall Clara Barton, the angel of Civil War battlefields, at the helm. Not all social activity proved so serious. Post-Civil War Americans devoured millions of dime novels, usually depicting the wilds of the woolly West. Paint-bedaubed Indians and quick-triggered gunmen like Deadwood Dick shot off vast quantities of powder, and virtue invariably triumphed. These lurid paperbacks were frowned upon by parents, but goggle-eyed youths read them in haylofts or in schools behind the broad covers of geography books. The king of the dime novelists was Harlan P. Halsey, who made a fortune by dashing off about 650 pot boilers, often one in a day. General Lew Wallace, lawyer, soldier, and author, was a colorful figure. Having fought with distinction in the Civil War, he sought to combat the prevailing wave of Darwinian skepticism with his novel Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ. A phenomenal success, the book sold an estimated 2 million copies in many languages, including Arabic and Chinese, and later appeared on stage and screen. It was the Uncle Tom's Cabin of the anti-Darwinists, who found in it support for the Holy Scriptures. An even more popular writer was Horatio Alger, a Puritan-reared New Englander, who in 1866 forsook the pulpit for the pen. Holy Horatio wrote more than 100 volumes of juvenile fiction that sold over 17 million copies. His stock formula depicted a poor boy new to the city who, through a combination of virtue, hard work, and bravery, achieved success, honor, and middle-class respectability. A kind of survival of the purest, especially non-smokers, non-drinkers, non-swearers, and non-liars. Although accusations of sexual impropriety haunted Alger throughout his life, he implanted in his readers moral lessons and the conviction that there is always room at the top, especially if one is lucky enough to save the life of the boss's daughter and marry her. Literature and the arts were not immune to the era's sweeping changes. Confronted by new cities and industries, American writers and artists forsook the romantic sentimentality of an earlier age and generated three interrelated currents in the arts: realism, naturalism, and regionalism. All three movements responded to the Gilded Age's urban industrial transformation. Realism quickly came to dominate post-Civil War American literature. Foregoing romantic pageantry and supernatural melodrama, American authors increasingly found their subjects in the coarse human comedy and material drama of the world around them. William Dean Howells, the celebrated father of American realism, emerged as the era's preeminent advocate of unsentimental literature. A printer's son from Ohio, Howells had scant schoolhouse education, but his busy pen carried him high into the literary circles of the East. In 1871, he became the editor-in-chief of the prestigious Boston-based Atlantic Monthly, where he championed the careers of several young American writers. In no less than 36 novels and nearly 200 books, he wrote about ordinary men and women in familiar surroundings, and about contemporary and sometimes controversial social themes. His most famous novel, The Rise of Silas Lapham, describes the moral trials of a newly rich paint manufacturer caught up in the caste system of Brahmin Boston. Other well-known works dealt with the once taboo subject of divorce and the reformers, strikers, and socialists of Gilded Age New York. Two recipients of Howells' patronage and friendship, Mark Twain and Henry James, carried literary realism to new heights. With his meager formal schooling in frontier Missouri, the mustachioed Twain typified a new breed of American authors in revolt against the elegant refinements of the old New England school of writing. Christened Samuel Langhorne Clemens, he had served for a time as a Mississippi riverboat pilot and later took his pen name, Mark Twain, from the boatman's cry that meant 2 fathoms. After a 2-week stint in the local Confederate militia, Twain journeyed westward to Nevada and California, a trip he described with a mixture of truth and tall tales in Roughing It. 1 year later, he teamed up with Charles Dudley Warner to write The Gilded Age, an acid satire on post-Civil War political corruption and speculative greed. The book gave a name to an era. Many other books flowed from Twain's busy pen. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer preceded The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, an American masterpiece that defied Twain's own definition of a classic as a book which people praise and don't read. Over the decades, countless readers have been captivated by Huck's and Jim's search for freedom and friendship across the colorful and often racist backdrop of the antebellum Mississippi River Valley. Twain's later years were soured by bankruptcy growing out of unwise investments, and he was forced to take to the lecture platform and amuse what he called the damned human race. Journalist, humorist, satirist, and foe of social injustice, he made his most enduring contributions in capturing frontier realism and colloquial humor in the authentic American dialect. Twain's homegrown vernacular met its match in Henry James's eloquently filigreed prose. Brother of Harvard professor William James, Henry James was a New Yorker who turned from law to literature and spent most of his life in Europe. Taking as his dominant theme the confrontation of innocent Americans with subtle Europeans, James penned a remarkable number of brilliant realist novels, including The Portrait of a Lady and The Wings of the Dove. His book, The Bostonians, was one of the first novels about the rising feminist movement. James's fiction experimented with point of view and interior monologue, and he frequently made women his central characters, exploring their inner reactions to complex situations with a deftness that marked him as a master of psychological realism. Long resident in England, he became a British subject shortly before his death. Like her friend James, Edith Wharton took a magnifying glass to the inner psychological turmoil and moral shortcomings of the post-Civil War high society. Born into money, Wharton spent her years in the blue-blooded social circles of New York, Newport, and Paris. In 1885, she married well, but not happily, and increasingly turned her energies to writing. Wharton's many novels, including The House of Mirth and The Age of Innocence, exposed the feudal struggles and interior costs of striving characters stuck on the social ladder. Wharton's portrayal of upper-crust social strife verged on naturalism, a more intense literary response than mainstream realism to the social dislocations and scientific tumult of the late 19th century America. Emphasizing the determinative influence of heredity and social environments in shaping character, naturalistic writers sought to apply detached scientific objectivity to the study of human beings, or human beasts, in French novelist Émile Zola's famous phrase. While realist authors often treated middle and upper-class characters in everyday settings, naturalistic novelists place lower-class, marginal characters in extreme or sordid environments, including the urban jungle, where they were subject to the cruel operations of brute instinct, degenerate heredity, and pessimistic determinism. Stephen Crane, the 14th child of a Methodist minister, exemplified this naturalistic urge in his writing. His Maggie, a Girl of the Streets, a brutal tale about a poor prostitute driven to suicide, exposed the seamy underside of life in urban industrial America. The novel proved too grim to find a publisher, so Crane had it printed privately. He rose quickly to prominence with The Red Badge of Courage, the stirring story of a bloodied young Civil War recruit under the extreme stress of fire. Crane himself had never seen a battle and wrote entirely from printed Civil War records. Sharing the misfortune of his many characters, he died of tuberculosis in 1900, when only 28. Candid, naturalistic portrayals of contemporary life and social problems were the literary order of the day by the turn of the century. Jack London, famous as a nature writer in such books as The Call of the Wild, depicted a future fascistic revolution in The Iron Heel, a book that displayed London's social leanings. Frank Norris, like London, a Californian, wrote The Octopus, an earthly saga of the stranglehold in which railroad and corrupt politicians held California wheat ranchers. A sequel, The Pit, dealt with the making and breaking of speculators on the Chicago Wheat Exchange. Conspicuous among the new naturalistic social novelists rising in the literary firmament was Theodore Dreiser, a homely, gangling writer from Indiana. He burst upon the literary scene in 1900 with Sister Carrie, a graphic narrative of a poor working girl adapting to urban life in Chicago and New York. She became one man's mistress, then elopes with another, and finally strikes out on her own to make a career on the stage. The fictional Carrie's disregard for prevailing moral standards so offended Dreiser's publisher that the book was soon withdrawn from circulation, though it later reemerged as an acclaimed American classic. Sharing a common documentary impulse with realist and naturalistic fiction, regionalism as a movement sought to chronicle the peculiarities of local ways of life before the coming wave of industrial standardization. By the end of the 19th century, practically every region of the country had its share of local colorists. At first blush, these regionalist writings accentuated the differences among still distant American locales and indulged in a bit of provincial nostalgia. At the same time, however, their work also served to demystify, to some extent, regional differences, especially among national audiences bent on post-war reunification. Twain, London, and Bret Harte, among other Western writers, popularized and often debunked the lusty legends of the Old West. A foppishly dressed New Yorker, Harte struck it rich in California with gold rush stories, especially The Luck of Roaring Camp and The Outcasts of Poker Flat. Catapulted suddenly into notoriety by those short stories, he never again matched their excellence or their popularity. Interest in local color writing about the South also revived in the aftermath of Reconstruction. Two black writers, Paul Laurence Dunbar and Charles W. Chestnut, brought their distinctive voices to late 19th century literature. Dunbar's poetry, particularly his acclaimed Lyrics of Lowly Life, and Chestnut's fiction, short stories in Howell's Atlantic Monthly and The Conjure Woman, embraced the use of black dialect and folklore, previously shunned by black authors, to capture the spontaneity and richness of Southern black culture. Pioneering women also contributed to the post-Civil War Southern literary scene. Drawing from her experience as a young bride and businesswoman in Louisiana, the daring feminist author Kate Chopin wrote candidly about adultery, suicide, and women's ambitions in The Awakening. Largely ignored after her death, Chopin was rediscovered by later readers, who cited her work as suggestive of the feminist yearnings that stirred beneath the surface of respectability in the Golden Age. Some important authors, of course, defied categorization. The gifted Henry Adams, son of Charles Francis Adams, grandson of John Quincy Adams, and great-grandson of John Adams, turned unrivaled family connections into a prolific career as a historian, novelist, and critic. In his 9-volume History of the United States during the administrations of Jefferson and Madison, Adams defended his patrician heritage from posthumous attack. He channeled his alarm at modern trends into his best-known work, The Education of Henry Adams, an autobiographical account of his own failure to come to grips with the chaotic forces of turn-of-the-century life. Realism and regionalism, more so than naturalism, also energized the American art world, much as they did the literary sphere. Philadelphia's native son, Thomas Eakins, created a veritable artistic catalog of his hometown's social, scientific, and sporting life at the end of the 19th century. Boston-born Winslow Homer, who as a youth had secretly drawn sketches in school, brought a similar mastery to the pastoral farms and swelling seas of the Northeast. Earthily American and largely resistant to foreign influences, he reveled in rugged realism and boldness of conception. His oil canvases of the sea and its fisher folk were striking. Probably no American artist has excelled him in portraying the awesome power of the ocean. Following in the footsteps of the expatriate writers Henry James and Edith Wharton, prominent American painters working in the realist style made their living abroad. James Whistler did much of his work, including the celebrated portrait of his mother in England. This eccentric and quarrelsome Massachusetts Yankee had earlier dropped out of West Point after failing chemistry. Had silicon been a gas, he later jested, I would have been a major general. Another gifted portrait painter, likewise self-exiled in England, was John Singer Sargent. His flattering but somewhat superficial likeness of the British nobility and America's nouveau riche were highly prized. Mary Cassatt, an American in exile in Paris, painted sensitive portrayals of modern women and children that earned her a place in the pantheon of the French Impressionist painters, whose work revolutionized the European art world after their 1874 debut. The most gifted sculptor yet produced by America was Augustus Saint Gaudens. Born in Ireland of an Irish mother and a French father, he became an adopted American. The national urge to commemorate the Civil War brought him a number of famous commissions, including the stirring Robert Gould Shaw Memorial, erected on Boston Common in 1897. It depicts Colonel Shaw, a young white Boston Brahmin officer, leading his black troops into battle in the Civil War. Music, too, was gaining popularity. America of the 1880s and 1890s was assembling high-quality symphony orchestras, notably in Boston, Chicago, and Philadelphia. The famed Metropolitan Opera House of New York was erected in 1883. In its fabled Diamond Horseshoe, the newly rich, often under the pretense of enjoying the imported singers, would flaunt their jewels, gowns, and furs. While symphonies and operas were devoted to bringing European music to elite American audiences, new strains of homegrown American music were sprouting in the South, another outgrowth of the regionalist trend. Black folk traditions like spirituals and ragged music were evolving into the blues, ragtime, and jazz, which would transform American popular music in the 20th century. A marvelous invention was the reproduction of music by mechanical means. The phonograph, though a squeakily imperfect instrument when invented by the deaf Edison, had by 1900 reached over 150,000 homes. Americans were rapidly being dosed with canned music, and the sitting room piano increasingly gathered dust. Wrenching changes to the nation's cities inspired a new generation of architects and planners to reshape American urban space with the City Beautiful movement. Its proponents wanted the new American city not just to look beautiful, but also to convey a confident sense of harmony, order, and monumentality. To achieve these effects, they copied European styles of Beaux Arts classicism and planning ideas from the master builder of Paris, Baron Georges-Eugène Haussmann, who in the 1860s had recast the City of Light with grand boulevards, parks, and public buildings. Aiming to assert America's prominence among the greatest urban cultures in the Western world, architects constructed grandiose urban landmarks such as New York's Grand Central Terminal. City planners like Daniel Burnham redesigned Chicago and Washington, D.C., in the belief that they could make them perfect progressive cities, inspiring civic virtue in their inhabitants. To this end, they joined contemporary landscape architects and park builders like Frederick Law Olmsted, who sought to foster virtue and egalitarian values with his designs for New York's Central Park and Boston's Emerald Necklace, as well as the campus of Stanford University, which opened in 1891. Burnham's first major project, which came to symbolize the City Beautiful movement, was his design for the great World's Columbian Exposition, held in Chicago in 1893. His imposing landscape of pavilions and fountains honored the 400th anniversary of Columbus's first voyage. This so-called dream of loveliness was visited by 27 million people, roughly equivalent to 2/5 of the nation's population. The Chicago Exposition did much to raise American artistic standards and promote city planning, although many fairgoers proved more interested in the contortions of a hoochie-coochie dancer named Little Egypt. Fun and frolic were not neglected by the workaday American. The pursuit of happiness, heralded in the Declaration of Independence, had by century's end become a frenzied scramble. People sought their pleasures fiercely, as they had overrun their continent and built their cities fiercely, and now they had more time to play. Varied diversions beckoned. The legitimate stage still flourished, as appreciative audiences responded to the lure of the footlights. Vaudeville, with its coarse jokes and graceful acrobats, continued to be immensely popular during the 1880s and 1890s, as were minstrel shows in the South, now performed by black singers and dancers, rather than by whites wearing blackface as in the North before the Civil War. The circus, high-tented and multi-ringed, finally emerged full-blown. Phineas T. Barnum, the master showman who had early discovered that the public likes to be humbugged, joined hands with James A. Bailey in 1881 to stage The Greatest Show on Earth. Colorful Wild West shows, first performed in 1883, were even more distinctively American. Headed by the knightly, goateed, and free-drinking William F. Buffalo Bill Cody, the troupe included war-whooping Indians, live buffalo, and dead-eye marksmen. Among them was the girlish Annie Oakley. Rifle in hand, she could at 30 paces perforate a tossed-up card half a dozen times before it fluttered to the ground, hence the term Annie Oakley for a punched ticket, and later for a free pass. Baseball, already widely played before the Civil War, was clearly emerging as a national pastime, if not a national mania. A league of professional players was formed in the 1870s, and in 1888 an all-star baseball team toured the world, using the pyramids as a backstop while in Egypt. Basketball was invented in 1891 by James Naismith, a YMCA instructor in Springfield, Massachusetts. Designed as an active indoor sport that could be played during the winter months, it spread rapidly and enjoyed enormous popularity in the next century. A gladiatorial trend towards spectator sports rather than participative sports was exemplified by football. This rugged game, with its dangerous flying wedge, had become popular well before 1889, when Yale man Walter C. Camp chose his first All-American team. The Yale-Princeton game of 1893 drew 50,000 cheering fans, while foreigners jeered that the nation was getting sports on the brain. Even pugilism, with its long background of bare-knuckle brutality, gained a new and gloved respectability in 1892. Agile Gentleman Jim Corbett, a scientific boxer, wrestled the world championship from the aging and alcoholic John L. Sullivan, the fabulous Boston Strong Boy. The land of the skyscraper was plainly becoming more standardized, owing largely to the new industrialization. Although race and ethnicity assigned urban Americans to distinctive neighborhoods and workplaces, to an increasing degree they shared a common popular culture, playing, reading, shopping, and talking alike. As the century drew to a close, the explosion of cities paradoxically made Americans more diverse and more similar at the same time.